Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Susan Kamei. I'm an affiliated faculty member with the USC Shinzo Ito Center, Japanese Religions and Culture. And on behalf of the Ito Center, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. In addition to those of you that have joined us in person, I understand we have a very large online audience, and we'll welcome your chat and questions as we move through the program. As I have been often saying about things related to the Japanese American incarceration, I wish that the things that had happened to our community in World War II would have just become footnotes in history. But sadly, as the phrase has become, we see history repeating itself. And that is the case with the Alien Enemies Act and how it's become part of the news cycle now. Duncan Williams, the director of the Ito Center, asked me to convey his regrets that he's not personally here to welcome you and to kick off the program. But Duncan and the EDA team are in Crystal City and on the front end of a East Coast tour of the EDHO Book of Names. And Brian and I will be catching up with them in the Poston pilgrimage in a couple of weeks. So we're all wearing many hats, but on behalf of Duncan and those as co-sponsoring organizations that I'd like to acknowledge now, thank you for your support. So we'd like to thank the Japanese American Citizens League, NCRR, the Korematsu Center at UC Irvine, and the USC Immigration Center for helping us spread the word. To kick us off, we're very pleased to have Brian Nia, that really needs no introduction to our Japanese American community, but to give everyone the benefit of Brian's background. He is the content director and editor for the Densho Encyclopedia. A Sansei, born and raised in Southern California, his Nisei parents were born and raised in Hawaii. His maternal grandfather was one of a small number of Japanese Americans from Hawaii who were interned, and hold that thought on the use of the word interned. And his mother's family went to Japan on an exchange ship during the war. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Brian publicly for all that he has done, his leadership, his scholarship, his collegiality in the public information about the Japanese American incarceration. He's had a number of positions with organizations and that include the Japanese American National Museum and the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii. He's a graduate of Harvey Mudd College and has an MA in Asian American Studies from UCLA. And so with that, Brian, thank you for kicking us off and giving us some historic context and the relevance for the Alien Enemies Act to us.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thanks everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I had a family emergency come up, and I had to fly out to Honolulu. So I'm coming to you from Honolulu. So, but I wish I could be there with you. So my job is to basically just give a quick overview of what happened in 1941 to 45, which was the last time the Alien Enemies Act was invoked, and really with a focus on the impact on the Japanese American community that included the internment of thousands of Japanese immigrant community leaders. And we should note here that this is mostly a separate story from the later mass exclusion and incarceration of all Japanese Americans, 120,000 people from the West Coast under the auspices of the infamous Executive Order 9066 that started later in 1942. And also, while there were more Japanese Americans in Hawaii than in the continental US in 1941, I'm mostly going to focus on the continent, given the limited time. Though a similar roundup also took place in Hawaii, though with one very important difference that I'll note in a moment. Um, so to start with, I want to go back a decade or so to the early 1930s as tensions between Japan and the US began to ramp up, leading to fears of war between the two countries. And in preparation for this, various federal agencies, most notably the FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence, began surveillance of Japanese American communities, out of which came the existence, the creation of custodial detention lists of who would be interned in the event of war. So the government was ready with these lists in the event of war. And so when war did come, when the US entered the war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, invoked the Alien Enemies Act through a series of proclamations that allowed for the apprehension of, quote, alien enemies deemed dangerous to the public health or safety of the United States, end quote. Detentions began immediately. My grandfather was actually arrested. My mom remembers them coming to get him like that night, like late at night on December 7th. And while Japanese consular officials and the like were rounded up, the bulk of those detained were actually longtime resident immigrants, which we in the Japanese American community refer to as Issei. Um, Now, due to restrictive immigration laws that first limited and later prohibited Japanese migration to the US after 1924, nearly all of these Issei had been in the US for decades and had decided to make their lives here, many raising American citizen children, the Nisei, who grew up like other Americans and American kids in the 10s, 20s, and 30s. The population was largely concentrated in the territory of Hawaii and on the west coast of the continental US. Um, Significantly, Issei and other Asian immigrants were prohibited by law from becoming naturalized US citizens, unlike their counterparts from Europe. So they were, in a sense, perpetually alien, regardless of how long they had been here and regardless of what they want, whether they wanted to be citizens or not. Um, those designated for detention through this pre-war surveillance were largely Issei community leaders, such as Buddhist priests, Japanese language school personnel, members of Issei economic and cultural groups, and the like. Most of them singled out largely for the positions they held in the ethnic community, as opposed to anything they had specifically done. Um, so by oops. So by December 10, just a couple days after the outbreak of war and the beginning of the arrest, about 1,300 Japanese had been detained. And according to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, practically all of those he had planned to arrest had already been taken into custody. Should note here that smaller numbers of resident German immigrants and just a handful of resident Italian immigrants were also detained, as well as larger numbers of German and Italian crew members of U.S. ships, or of ships in U.S. ports. Sorry. Um, the stories of detentions echo in our community and have a similar broad storyline. Those of us who have done oral history interviews and read memoirs and so forth, the stories are inevitably those of mysterious men in suits appearing at the door in the hours, days, and weeks after the outbreak of war, taking away the family patriarch for questioning. The family left with no idea as to where he was being taken and how long he would be gone. Should also note a few women were detained, very few, but there were a few. And while in Hawaii there was a generally similar process, there was an important difference in that Hawaii was under martial law, and thus, in addition to Japanese immigrants, US citizens were also detained at this point. One thing that always blows my mind is that two of the Nisei who were interned in Hawaii were actually sitting members of the Hawaii territorial legislature at the time, which is just, mind-boggling to consider. Although in this day and age, it's like, yeah, anyway. So by the middle of February, there about 2,200 Japanese had been detained, about 1,400 Germans, 264 Italians. So remember, a lot of those are the ship crew members. There was another big wave of arrests that also took place a little later in February. And so, what happens to these men? They're mostly held in local facilities first, here in LA, in the LA County Jail, as well as in quickly assembled detention camps such as Tuna Canyon or Griffith Park. They were held in immigration station buildings at places like San Francisco and Seattle. And then anywhere from a few days to weeks later, most of the West Coast internees were then transferred to one of three larger and more distant detention centers run by the INS. And those were Fort Missoula, Montana, here shown in this picture, um, Fort Lincoln, which is in Bismarck, North Dakota, seen in these photos. And the third was in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And each of these internment camps held about 1,000 Issei in this first phase of internment, which is taking place in the spring of 42 into the fall. From here, it gets very complicated, and I don't have time to go into details, but the key points are that hearings take place at all of these camps, and though they were grossly unfair in ways that are almost comical when you read the details today, about half of the internees were essentially sentenced or designated to be interned for the duration of the war. They were taken first to camps run by the US Army in the late fall of 42. And then as those camps started to fill up with POWs, they were sent back to the Justice Department and interned in Justice Department camps. And Santa Fe ends up being the one that's the primary long-term internment camp for these men. And in many of the camps, they were held alongside German immigrant internees and or German and Italian ship crew members. The other roughly half of the internees were cleared essentially and designated for release or parole. But the irony is that being Japanese Americans, being released meant that they were just sent to another series of concentration camps, because by that time, Executive Order 9066 had been declared, and this whole program of rounding up and incarcerating all Japanese Americans in the West Coast were taking place. So the men who were released or paroled from these Justice Department camps generally ended up in these War Relocation Authority camps. The advantage being that they could at least be reunited with their families. This photo shows one such man, Dwight Uchida, who's reunited with his family at Topaz after his internment at Missoula. And this brings up another common incarceration narrative, which is that of families remembering the Issei patriarch returning from Justice Department internment, looking unrecognizably older and refusing to speak of his prior internment. So with that, just want to briefly note the aftermath. As noted, some were held in internment for the duration of the war by the Justice Department. Others released or paroled to the WRA concentration camps. Some, including my family, sent to the Crystal City Justice Department camp, which was known as the family camp. As Susan mentioned earlier, a pilgrimage to that site is going on, I believe, as we speak. And that became kind of the family Justice Department camp. Many of those families, well, I don't know about many, but some of those families being designated to return to Japan on an exchange ship. And I should also note that in the internment camp system, again, not the WRA system, but the one run by the Justice Department, 3 men were shot to death by guards while they were interned. And with that introduction, I will turn it back to Susan and the rest of the panel to talk about the present.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. Do you want to take a moment and help sort the use of internment versus incarceration?
Sure. Yeah. So for years, I think the common terminology we just referred to this whole episode as internment, and I think in the last probably 20 years or so, there's been an effort to really disentangle the terminology and note that internment being a term specifically that applies to enemy aliens who are being detained, and thus what we're talking about here with the Justice Department detaining enemy aliens is truly internment. The mass removal and incarceration of other Japanese Americans by the War Relocation Authority, 60% or so of them were US citizens. this is not internment by definition, because these are not enemy aliens. These are largely American citizens. And so I think the terminology that we choose to, that we've tried to use is incarceration, rather than at the time the more euphemistic terms of evacuation. Evacuation implies that this is being done for your own protection, as with an earthquake or a flood or something. And to use incarceration, imprisonment, detention, etc., as a terminology separate from the internment that it's applicable in the Justice Department system in the roundup of enemy aliens.
Great, thank you. Yes, so we're making a distinction between those that were imprisoned as a consequence of Executive Order 9066 and those that we're talking about today as a function of the Alien Enemies Act. And so with that, we've got so much to understand and be up to speed on in terms of what the current Trump administration is using, how it's using the Alien Enemies Act in policies and practices today. And I'm thrilled that we have Professor Robert Chang, one of our nation's leading scholars on issues of race and interethnic relations, and one of the most recognized voices on Asian American law issues, here with us today. Bob has come with the Korematsu Center to be the executive director of the UC Irvine Fred T. Korematsu Center for Law and Equality, and holds as the inaugural chair the Sylvia Mendez Presidential Chair for Civil Rights. Professor Chang founded the Korematsu Center, named after our pioneering civil rights leader, Fred T. Korematsu, in 2009 at the Seattle University School of Law. And the center leads numerous initiatives and projects focused on research, advocacy, and clinical education. Professor Chang has an AB from Princeton in molecular biology, and there is a story there, I'm sure, and an MA in philosophy and a JD from Duke University. So thank you, Bob, for joining us.
So thank you, Susan, for the generous introduction, the Ito Center for sponsoring this. So I was reflecting on the cover, the title of Susan's book, When Can We Go Back to America, which was written in the context of World War II. But I've been thinking about this in the context of today, when can we go back to America? I feel in some ways that we've gotten so far from what we think about makes our nation great in terms of the Constitution, separation of powers, and the rule of law. And so I know that we're talking about the Alien Enemies Act and its application and historical resonances, but I also want to place what's happening today in the broader context of all of the assaults on the rule of law. So executive orders attacking law firms, funding of universities, attacks on free speech of non-citizens, which then also has a chilling effect on the speech of citizens. We have the National Guard being deployed in various cities. We have the cases going on right now. There are hearings today. And it's like I keep checking my news to see what happened with the Ninth Circuit in its evaluation of what Judge Immergut did in Portland, and then also what is happening with the Chicago case and Judge Perry's hearing. Is she, like some of the other judges, also going to issue a temporary restraining order? And so when we think about what's going on today, part of the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, we saw the first time around was a first step before the broader treatment of Japanese Americans more broadly with 9066. And so when we think about, well, why should we care about the Alien Enemies Act here, especially in terms of the small group that is being targeted? So when President Trump on March 15, 2025, issued the proclamation invoking the Alien Enemies Act, he singled out a small group, and it wasn't Venezuelans wholesale. It was Venezuelans who were members of a particular gang, one particular gang. And so it's that group. But when I think about what else is going on, that was the first step in terms of, in some ways, scapegoating a group, tarring a group with criminality. And this was followed soon after with it's called vacatur. It's a weird legal term, but the termination of temporary protected status for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans, which makes them subject to immediate deportation should the government choose to act in that way. So we had the Alien Enemies Act invoked with a small group, and then we have a broader treatment of Venezuelan immigrants. And it's scary in some ways how closely it mirrors what took place before. Now, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, like what is that even? And so I printed it up because I think it's important for us to know what it says. It says Congress granted power to the President of the United States that whenever there shall be a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government, so any foreign nation or government, or any invasion or predatory incursion that shall be perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States by any foreign nation or government, the president then has great powers, and these powers allow him then, and it's him in this instance, and it's always been him in our nation's history, but allows him to then declare individuals or groups of individuals who are aliens, so non-citizens. This includes people who are undocumented. It includes people who are legally here. It includes legal permanent residents, because legal permanent residents are not citizens. That president then can declare them to be enemy aliens. And after the declaration that they're enemy aliens, it allows then the administration to decide then that some are such a danger to our security and peace that they can first be detained and then they can be deported. Now, one critical thing about detention and deportation is that this is a civil action. It is not a criminal action. And so what that also goes back to is the long history of how we got to this place. Why do we treat deportation as not punishment? Deportation to me, for people who have lived here, who are here, is banishment. Banishment historically has always been punishment. But this changed with regard to an early case involving Chinese immigrants, Fong Yuting versus the United States, where the US Supreme Court said that deportation is not punishment. Because it's not punishment, you don't get any of the other things that come along with the process, including a right to counsel and things like that. And so this power that exists when there is war or when there is a predatory invasion or predatory incursion, and it has to be by a foreign nation or government. Now, during World War II, there was not a question about the valid invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. Why? Because there was a declaration of war. Once there's a declaration of war, then this allows the president to act on that basis. There was not that challenge there that President Roosevelt had improperly invoked the act. The question, though, then after that is, well, what happens after that in terms of the treatment? Today, there is a question, a legal question in a number of cases as to whether or not the president acted lawfully in invoking the Alien Enemies Act based on this argument that this particular gang has engaged in an invasion or predatory incursion. Now, you might also wonder, gang, well, they're not a foreign nation or government. That's absolutely correct. But it might surprise you to learn that there are 3 federal district court judges, and I don't think it's good to call judges, Republican judges or Democratic judges or things like that. But I will note that the 3 district court judges who said or found that this was a valid invocation of the Alien Enemies Act here were Trump appointees. So there are 10 cases now going on in various district courts. 3 are from California. I'm sorry, 2 are in the Central District of California, 1 in Colorado, 1 in New York, 1 in Pennsylvania, and 4 in 3 different districts in Texas. Now, for now, there has been some action with regard to the US Supreme Court putting a stop to some of what had been going on. Not on the merits yet, but through this thing called the emergency docket. And if we have time, I would love to explain what this thing is. It's called the emergency docket, which is where the US Supreme Court keeps stopping what I think the lower courts are doing correctly in terms of stopping or limiting the excesses of the executive branch. But the US Supreme Court, surprisingly, in a case called AARP versus Trump, said that, whoa, you can't just do this. You're not, we're not deciding whether or not you've invoked it properly. We'll leave that for the lower court to decide, but that there has to be some measure of due process involved, some notice, because if the government declares you to be an enemy alien, well, you ought to be able to challenge that classification. You ought to be able to say, well, I'm not a member of this gang that you've singled out. Because the process that had existed at the time really just included putting them on planes and then just sending them, deporting them, in most instances to El Salvador, or would have been El Salvador because of the agreement with the administration there. Now, you might be wondering, well, AARP, why is the Association of American Retired Persons suing Trump about this? What is their special interest? It turns out that those are just initials. And when it went back, the case now is no longer known as AARP versus Trump, but as WMM versus Trump. And it's because AARP, the one that we know about, the organization, filed a motion to intervene in the district court in Texas for the limited purpose of asking the court, well, since you're using initials anyway, and there is another person, WMM, in this case, can you call it WMM? And the federal district court judge says, all right, I will grant you this limited motion to intervene for this purpose, granted it, and then AARP, the one that we know about, is no longer part of this case. These are just, kind of silly little facts, details that emerge in these cases. So WMM then went to the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit, in a surprise to many of us, found that the invocation in a 2-1 split panel, that the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act was unlawful, that there had not been the predicate of an invasion or a predatory incursion by a foreign nation or government. Now, you might wonder, well, gosh, that's good. What happens after that? Well, normally the government would appeal to the US Supreme Court, and then we would wait to see what happens here. But there's this other process with regard to the way that our intermediate federal appellate courts operate. So this was decided by a 3-judge panel. The Fifth Circuit, all of the judges in the circuit, there's a process where a case can be reheard, and it's called en banc. So reheard by all of the active judges on the Fifth Circuit. And this has happened now. The effect of that is that WMM, the opinion by the Fifth Circuit, is vacated. It's no longer good. It's a nullity. Now we're waiting for what happens with the briefing before the Fifth Circuit en banc. The privilege of working with counsel at Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco and lawyers at Asian, they keep changing the name, but the one in DC, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and also attorneys at the law firm of Covington and Burling, filing an amicus brief where the lead party was the JACL, the National JACL. Now, for those of you who may be less familiar with this, an amicus brief is a friend of the court brief. So you're not actually representing a party in the litigation, but you're representing an individual or group, or sometimes a coalition, who then files a brief before the court as a friend of the court. And the idea there is, well, we have something to say, and we think that it's important for you to hear about this. When the Korematsu Center engages in amicus advocacy, part of our theory behind this is that it's a way to democratize the courts, because you have litigation, it affects the interests of those parties, but often many other individuals or groups who are not part of the litigation. Well, amicus advocacy, by democratizing the courts, allows for those individuals or groups to have a voice or a say. Now, with regard to the JACL, well, what did the JACL have to say about this? Well, part of what we try to do often in our amicus briefs is to remind the court of times when our country has not lived up to its democratic ideals, when our courts sometimes have failed. And the JACL and other Japanese American groups have a distinct sort of voice in this because of the in some ways, we sometimes think about it as a way for them to operate or act as the conscience of the court, to remind the court and also the public, because the other function for amicus briefs for us includes public education. We're speaking to the judges and the justices, but we're also speaking to the public because quite often the public is not familiar with so many of these stories. I mean, who knew, right, that it wasn't just Executive Order 9066 that put people into camps. It was also the Alien Enemies Act, and in some ways it was the Alien Enemies Act that was the first step, a trial run in some ways of something that would become much broader. And so in this amicus brief, we talk about what happened the first time around when President Roosevelt invoked the Alien Enemies Act. It's wonderful. We had the thicker description of what took place with so many of the men primarily who were rounded up, and the difference in terms of the camps, internment camps versus incarceration camps, and the other things that were part of it. Now, the thing about those hearings that Brian told us about, civil, it's not a criminal trial. And so you don't have right to counsel. And that's one thing that is very limiting in terms of somebody who is trying to assert their rights in the face of government action against them. We also told the story of certain persons and families who were impacted by the arrests that followed the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. We also highlight the challenges or issues with regard to the evidence that existed during World War II, the evidence that largely did not exist, and in some ways, the circular reasoning that existed. So the circular reasoning included that, I can find what I was going to read, but maybe I can't find it. But General DeWitt during World War II said that the fact that there had been no sabotage identified by Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants, well, that's why it highlighted that's the danger here, the fact that it had not existed. And the US government is saying the same thing this time around. When it came out that so many of those who were caught up in the arrest following the invocation of the alien, the proclamation and the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, had no criminal records or backgrounds. The US government, in this sad echo of the past, said, well, it's the fact that they don't have those criminal backgrounds that makes them so dangerous. And so part of what we try to do in the stories that we tell, to offer the voice, the moral voice of the JACL, and here also joined by over 60 Asian American organizations, to remind the country and the judges and justices about what took place before, including also the very thin evidence that was used to justify this treatment, to then say, well, we should pay attention to these lessons because we're in danger of repeating history. And so I've probably used my time. And so I will stop there.
Thank you, Bob. I was actually very relieved to hear that the work to prepare these briefs and to form these coalitions actually started not long after the inauguration, because this had been a campaign point by then candidate Trump, and that there were those that were anticipating that this work was going to be needed, and that actually came as a great relief to me to know that so much effort has been going on a national basis to be preparing these briefs. So thank you. Well, let's come back to the emergency docket, because I think that's an important point to help understand what's happening in the news today. And Professor Reese, you are a little busy these days. So let me give you a little background. Professor Reese teaches and co-directs the USC Gould School of Law Immigration Clinic and directs the Immigration Detention and Appellate Clinic and the Legal Professions courses. And this is something that I think is really great. Under her supervision, second and third year law students represent individuals in removal proceedings seeking humanitarian forms of relief. And the venues include not only the Immigration Court, the Board of Immigration Appeals, but also the Federal Appeals Court for the Ninth Circuit. And she also oversees the Immigrant Legal Assistance Center, which provides free legal assistance to USC students, faculty, and staff and their families in connection with immigration issues. So thank you so much, Jean, and thank you for taking the time to join us.
Sure, sure. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm such an impressive panel today that I'm happy to be part of it. So I thought maybe I would talk about the Alien Enemies Act in the concept of immigration enforcement today, and why invoke the Alien Enemies Act. And it has everything to do with this idea of mass deportation, right? Mass removal of immigrants from the country. And it's a one piece of a very large pie of tactics, very aggressive tactics that we're seeing by this current administration. So, why the Alien Enemies Act? It authorizes the president to remove a group of people. And although there are due process protections that apply in this under the Alien Enemies Act, they're very minimal. And many non-citizens present in the United States have certain due process protections, including going in front of an immigration judge, having the government provide evidence that they're present in the US in violation of immigration law, seeking applications for protections such as asylum, such as cancellation of removal, which is for somebody who may have US citizen or permanent resident family members who would face a hardship if they were removed. And there is a huge backlog in the immigration court. The last time I checked, I think it was at close to 3 million cases. And so if the president wants to deport 1 million a year, or as many people as the president is attempting to deport, having them go through these proceedings, which is their right. And one thing is the Constitution, provides protections for non-citizens in the US, but the immigration laws, the Immigration Nationality Act, also require certain due process protections. It's going to take a long time. So the Alien Enemies Act is a way to circumvent those pathways and those potential protections to order someone removed. And we saw it happen in that kind of first plane that left very quickly to El Salvador and with very little due process. And some of the cases at issue, the due process protections are notice and very little time to challenge whether or not someone is a member of the gang, the Venezuelan gang, Tren de Aragua, or should this apply to them? So that's why it's being used as a tool of enforcement. And one of the things that we're also seeing is this concept of invasion, right? So this is a theme that is circulated throughout immigration history, and I'll talk about one of the foundational cases of modern, immigration jurisprudence, the Che-Tamping case involving, what was called at that time the Chinese Exclusion Acts. There was no war with China. There was a treaty that was a reciprocal treaty for labor. But the Supreme Court in that case said, it's not for us to determine whether or not there's an invasion, even if there's not like a military attack. It's for the president to decide whether or not there is national security issues, whether or not we are threatened. And that is conclusive upon the judiciary. So we don't look behind. And that's a very old case, but I think we're seeing that kind of conflict today where we're talking about migrants as invaders who are intending to do harm. And I'll just quote from one of the several cases challenging the Alien Enemies Act. One of the judges said, there is nothing in the Alien Enemies Act that justifies a finding that refugees migrating from Venezuela or Tren de Aragua gangsters who infiltrate the migrants are engaged in an invasion or predatory incursion. They do not seek to occupy territory, to oust American jurisdiction from any territory, or to ravage territory. TDA may well be engaged, that's the Tren de Aragua, may well be engaged in narcotics trafficking, but that is a criminal matter, not an invasion. So why, we're looking at invasion often too to justify these extraordinarily aggressive tactics. So arresting people and sending them to a prison in El Salvador under the Alien Enemies Act, but also other things that we're seeing. Recently in June, the Department of Homeland Security and now the Department of Justice, which houses the immigration courts, have reinterpreted a statute that provides for bond hearings for persons who are arrested in the US, who may be in violation of immigration law, but who are not, who have been here for longer than 2 years. For 60 years, those individuals would be eligible for a bond hearing to determine whether they pose a danger or a flight risk. That has been reinterpreted to treat all of those individuals as if they were still at the border seeking entry and requiring mandatory detention. Why do that? Well, it's going to be harder to remove people from the US if they have the ability to get out on bond and fight their cases in a backlogged immigration court process. Many people that I know firsthand are giving up because the conditions of detention are so terrible. Detentions are run by for-profit corporations. We're seeing big, what's called soft-sided camps. And all of this is part of this really aggressive enforcement. And I think the invasion rhetoric surrounding it, this administration is often conflating people who are present to do harm with people who are present in violation of immigration law. And as my co-panelist pointed out, immigration law is a civil law. So being present in the US in violation of immigration laws is not a crime. But there is this conflation between that I think justifies some of these aggressive tactics. And so the Alien Enemies Act kind of conversations are essentially the president is the one who can determine in dealing with foreign countries whether or not there's an invasion. And the judiciary can't look to that. And that's kind of what is the government's argument in a very simplistic nutshell. But the case history for Alien Enemies Act is not thorough. There's not that many. It's only been invoked in times of a declared war, and there seems to be this requirement that the courts can at least see if it's a valid use of the statute. They can at least interpret it to see if it applies. And so I think that's the big challenge. But this kind of overall enforcement, I'll just say, like, also the reinterpretation of birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment, that's an enforcement tool, because that would make it easier to remove people and that would deter migration. So that's also being used as an enforcement tool. Let's see, I haven't kept track of my time at all, but I will say one other thing that we've seen with these aggressive tactics that is very much related to this idea of a foreign invasion is what we've seen happening in Southern California, specifically in Los Angeles over the summer, with the targeting and arresting of individuals at Home Depots, at bus stops, at places where, agricultural locations, based on the way that they look and whether they speak Spanish or English with an accent. And that is part of that idea of kind of going back to the foundational case, Che Champing. One of those issues was people who are coming who will not assimilate. So it's definitely very much that idea of targeting people based on the way that they look and the language that they speak as part of this overall enforcement. We recently filed a TRO for an individual who was arrested at a car wash, and his leg was broken during the arrest. And he was taken by immigration officials to the hospital where he had surgeries and where he was kept, over a month, and was, guarded by 4 to 5 immigration agents. He was never charged with being in violation of immigration law. So, you know, people think that's crazy, but we've seen it before, and we've seen this kind of mass detention, detaining people, and I think that's kind of the movement that we're going with. And Alien Enemy Acts, unfortunately, is a tool in that. I will say the judge issued the TRO and ordered ICE to remove their guards. Our client wasn't able to eat or sleep or see family or use, eat or sleep without supervision, use the bathroom with guards there, wasn't able to see his family, and had limited access to, his attorneys. And the judge said, this is the cornerstone of American society, is freedom from liberty, freedom from restraint without some sort of due process. And here we didn't even have allegations of a violation of the law. So I point that out as like these very aggressive tactics. But so I'm happy to answer other questions about that. But this idea of due process and humane processes, and I think the Alien Enemies Act is one way to get around some of the protections that are built into our immigration system and some of the flaws that delay people either being removed or getting their statuses.
Thank you, Jean. One of the things I've noticed from the time that I started teaching about the Japanese American incarceration 9 years ago, is that the rhetoric has now changed purposefully. That before there was a distinction that I think most people were willing to make between legal immigrants in the United States, non-citizens, aliens in the United States, versus those that were illegal. And now we've just seen this conflation. We've been using that word today into that all immigrants of all backgrounds should be suspect and feared. And I talk about this as immigration NIMBYism, that, now that I've gotten in, no one else should. We are grateful to have Kathy Masaoka here. And one of the goals that I have had for this program is that we could leave with things that we could do. I hear from so many, I think it's not unusual to feel helpless, and I dare say hopeless in what's going on with this onslaught of administrative activity. And so I'm glad that Kathy is here to help give us some tangible ways that we could be involved and do things if we so choose. By background, she's, like me, a native Los Angelino, born and raised in Boyle Heights, the Vietnam War and Asian American Studies student at UC Berkeley. And that has had an important influence on how she has come to be living her principles. And she has, for many years, worked on issues related to youth and workers, housing in Little Tokyo, was a big redress champion, and continues to serve as a co-chair for the Nikkei for Civil Rights and Redress, and CRR, and many other groups that include Nikkei Progressives and Vigilant Love. Kathy, thank you for all you do and for joining us. It's good to do it without Kathy.
I think Tracy Kato-Kiriyama is going to also add on some things
Please, thank you.
in terms of what people can do. But I wanted to start out with, okay, let me get my notes. And I want to thank Susan and the other panelists for really a lot of good information, things to think about. But I wanted to express appreciation also to the first generation, the Issei, and the immigrants who came to the US and had the strength and resilience to carve out a life. Some were able to build families here in the face of hostile laws and abundance of racism. I know that I would not be here if not for them, except for the indigenous peoples whose land we occupy, and for the descendants of the enslaved people who were kidnapped from Africa. Most of the people in this country would not be here. Most of us would not be here if not for the immigrant ancestors. So I think that really, think about that and really appreciate their strength. A couple of things is that overall, some of this is abstract and not so concrete, but it is important to keep learning from history as we are today, our own as well as others, to understand that our whole history is all interconnected, and to challenge ideas that we had accepted as truth and be open to new ones and unlearning our old ideas. And as I get older, I keep on finding things that I need to change. So one is like around the Alien Enemies Act. I had never heard about it. You know, working in redress, I never heard about it or paid attention to it. I think as Bob mentioned, this wasn't really noticed. And I first learned about it several years ago from Kanji Sahata, who has since passed, but he was working on displays for the Tuni Canyon Detention Center, and they were at Janum Museum. And I looked at it and I said, oh, this is so old and archaic. I mean, I don't even know why this is important to know. You know, I just sort of dismissed it. And then, you know, now I think about why wasn't that ever challenged earlier? You know, it's just been around for so long. I think that many of us had accepted the idea that somehow aliens, you know, or immigrants did not have the same rights as all people. And that word is being used, or the government used that perception about aliens and used it not only for the Issei, but also for the Japanese American population as a whole. And they said, well, they're aliens, the Issei, and there are non-aliens. So, you know, sticking that word aliens in there to make sure that that was attached to Japanese Americans during World War II, not the idea of citizens. And I think that we also kind of bought into this idea as a community when we talk about 120,000 plus Japanese Americans being incarcerated, and we emphasize 2/3 were citizens, as if it was really wrong for citizens, but it was somehow okay for the immigrants to be rounded up and taken away. And as I think was said, due process is for all people, immigrants, documented and undocumented alike. So a little story is that I always thought my grandfather, this is information that I had to unlearn. I always thought my grandfather, Soshi Kadota, Issei, who was picked up by the FBI right after Pearl Harbor, December 7th. But I learned that this was not true. I also thought he was just another individual Issei, you know, like so many who had been picked up and taken to a camp, Bismarck in his case. But when I learned more about what happened to him in other Issei in Santa Barbara County, where he was from, Santa Maria, it put his individual experience into a broader picture. And I learned this from Professor Russell Endo, who was teaching at the time at the University of Colorado, maybe within the last 5 years. I never knew this. My grandfather Soshi was one of 265 Issei men rounded up in a mass raid by the FBI over a 3-day period. And those 3 days, as Brian kind of mentioned, in February 18, 19, and 20. He was picked up on February 19, 1942. This is the day that Executive Order 9066 was issued by FDR. This was a double whammy for the community. Their fathers and leaders rounded up, and now they were all facing removal from the West Coast. With a roundup of so many among a community that numbered just under 2,200 people in that county, that was like over 10% were taken, fathers. It left the farms and the businesses and the 4 major Japan towns in disarray. The FBI continued to sow fear when they set up roadblocks and stopped cars, taking Issei men into custody. These men were taken to the Santa Barbara jail since there were no facilities set up for these numbers, and quickly moved to Los Angeles, to San Pedro, Tuni Canyon, or in my grandfather's case, to Griffith Park, which took the overflow from Tuni Canyon. Again, they were not set up for receiving these numbers of people. General DeWitt was so eager to move the Issei from the West Coast that they shipped them out before any hearings could be held. And the officials wrote my grandfather's notes that this guy didn't appear to be a problem. There was no threat from him, but he was shipped out in 2 days from Griffith Park to Bismarck, North Dakota. The family did not know where he was taken, and we never knew that he was actually in LA. So mass raids, communities in fear, families separated, poor detention facilities, no hearings, taken to distant places with no ability to contact their family, no due process. That is what is happening today. So what can we do? I think one is demanding due process for all, for sure, no matter your status, no matter if you're called a criminal, no matter what, everybody is afforded, has a right to due process. And to support those that are challenging the Alien Enemies Act and actually figure out some way to really undo it. But I think the way that we are building support for immigrants is by building community. And actually, I want Tracy to kind of talk more about this first. And
Oh,
is
yeah.
there, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You want to introduce?
Yeah. Let me introduce Trace. Award-winning, multi-transdisciplinary artists recognized for their work as a writer, performer, theater deviser, cultural producer, community organizer, and audiobook narrator. The through line and inspiration of much of TKK's work are tied to themes of survival, interconnectedness, death, loss, illness, and regeneration, like topics all, remembrance, legacies of silence and noise, trauma, and intergenerational reclamation, and reimagining our dreams of the past and the future. TKK might best be known to our USC community for their show Tales of Clamor, that I was honored to be a faculty co-sponsor for the USC Visions and Voices Arts and Culture Series in 2023. That was a moving, memorable event. So PKK.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, I am so honored to be a part of this panel. And thank you so much. I hope everyone in this room by now feels as angry and upset as I feel, right? As an artist, as a poet, as a theater maker, an actor, and a Scorpio, I am a professional emotional person. I am a professional feeler. And, I can hear stories over and over again about our parents and grandparents. And it's just as fresh as I feel like I just heard it yesterday, because we understand that this history, these stories, these memories are still living. They're not only living in our bodies, literally, when we think of these specific memories and stories and things that happen to our families, but we see it all around us, right? Just in the past 2 days, I've gotten several texts from people in my neighborhood about ice showing up at the local Home Depot, where my partner and I go all the time. Yeah, so I think in terms of, what can we do? I just want to offer a few things that I'm sure most of you are already engaged in or hopefully supporting, but it's worth noting, for Nikkei Progressives. So we have several cards up here to share with you. I hope you'll come and take some of our information. We have an immigration committee, an electoral committee, a little Tokyo committee. We also work on reparations very actively, Kathy and I, with many other people in that committee. And, we're literally right here. So you can talk with us afterwards. And there are local organizations, right in this room, where we can actually do work directly. And our immigration committee is part of a larger coalition, the Inland Coalition for Immigrant Justice, ICIJ, in the Inland Empire. And they do a lot of critical work. They're part of a much larger coalition as well. So I think Kathy will speak a little bit more on some actions that are happening or support that's happening at Adelanto, which is a detention center. We also support CHIRLA, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights Los Angeles. They do a lot of direct work. Unión del Barrio, friends of mine are very active in that. They do rapid response when they get a call in the area. So they understand that it's really necessary for us to do work locally, right, in our own neighborhoods. NDLON, the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, again, national network. They do a lot of incredible work. And all of these groups are in some way, shape, or form related to each other. Immigrant defenders, a number of attorneys that are doing a lot of legal work, right? Pro bono legal work, but also trainings for the rest of us, attorneys and non-attorneys like myself. So, I want to really highlight the local aspect that, and the donation aspect. I think that all of these organizations that I named are doing so much work beyond the time and resources that they have usually, that they can really utilize support, actual financial support. So if you are a student, a faculty member, with a very full plate on campus, there's always ways to engage donor dollars from yourself, your own pocket, and your family members, your community, your friends. I'm having a birthday party this this Sunday, and, we're raising money for a local organization. Like, you can do all kinds of things, right, with what's in your actual wheelhouse. Getting together, being on a text thread, a signal thread, a Discord with people literally in your own neighborhood to stay on top of what's going on. My friend who is not, she does not consider herself an activist, but things are so bad. The one silver lining is that so many more people that I know in my own neighborhood in the South Bay are activated. And so through her Ring, the doorbell system, simple surveillance, kind of creepy, but it is a thing, and it's accessible to people. Through that system, actually, she's connected with a network of folks in the South Bay who do alerts through that Ring community, to alert each other about what's happening at the car washes, at the local Home Depots, and so forth. I also feel like, as an artist, I also want to say to all the creatives in the room, which is every single person, the importance of us writing and using our creative communication to engage with folks on a heart level, like sharing stories, like Kathy shares all the time, and relating to people. It may sound, I don't know. I hope it sounds concrete. You know what I mean? Like, the importance of our organizing work really rests upon relationship building, which really rests upon conversations and breaking bread. We do it all the time. We break bread and we have conversations with our folks. We talk about, how do you talk about this difficult thing with your family and friends? And we actually have sessions about that. And I do think it's so important. I think that if you are a creative, by trade, a writer, a poet, a theater artist, a filmmaker, there are so many ways in which we need to write, to share these critical pieces of information in various formats, right? That can relate to folks in a different way. And we have to combat the language that is happening, right? I feel it's so weird. I've always grown up feeling very like an enemy alien. Like, I feel like enemy alien is somewhere in my identity. I've always felt that way. I know a lot of other Japanese Americans who are children of those who were incarcerated, who kind of have that sense of like, oh yeah, that's like in our background, like we're enemy aliens. You know what I mean? There's no separation for me. My grandparents, three of my grandparents, they were Issei. There's no separation for me, like in terms of them being citizens versus non-citizens versus naturalized citizens. You know what I mean? They suffered actually the most and did the most for my family. And so I think about that a lot. What it means when people in power also have use of language and have the ability to literally culture shift, right? And have us thinking about migrants, immigrants in a very specific way. And we don't even, it becomes subconscious. So we have the responsibility to make the connections between past and present as we look into our future. So there are many ways. There are so many ways. We have these red cards that you can come pick up some. And Kathy, I know you want to add more things. Yes.
Just a few more things.
Yeah.
Because older people have asked, well, what can I do? I don't want to put myself in the face of violence or endanger my life. So, there are things like not supporting businesses that don't align with your values. That doesn't take, you don't have to put yourself in danger. Tabling with information about what is going on and how to support, of course, as Tracy mentioned, donating. And, even also helping to prepare bags of groceries that go out to the immigrant families. And we work with a group called API Rise, and don't ask me what it stands for, but it's Asian Pacific Islander Reentry group that works with people that mainly from Southeast Asia that served time in prison, came out, they're trying to support them in just jobs, etc. But they often face deportation immediately after coming out, or they're out and they're face deportation. So a lot of accompany people to their check-ins and also court hearings. So I think that a lot of, legal help, and I've heard of the USC, great work in trying to find attorneys that will support people for free, not pro bono. Making calls to the detention center like Adelanto, which is very unfriendly. People are hours on the phone trying to make calls to see if they could set up visitations. And the people there are determined to isolate people. So people there can't even really accept calls unless you know exactly what their bunk number is. And you don't know their bunk number unless you go there and you see them and they can tell you. So it's just information is blocked totally. So they try to find out where that person is, what visitation hours are, and set those times up. We had 16 people go on Monday to Adelanto. 3 of them couldn't see the person because it was too full. They said come back 3 hours later. And then they told them, oh, that person went to the medical check-in or whatever. So they waited for nothing. But that is a treatment that people have at Adelanto. They don't really see daylight. They're in places that are like, there's no sky. And then they had a shutdown, so they didn't see any outside area at all. So these visitations are important, because people want, to talk to people and visit with people. And I just want to put again, national Endilon is national. So people anywhere can support Endilon. Adopt a corner is one of the things that they're pushing is people to be at the Home Depot corners to support the workers there and to be on the watch for anything coming. And I guess, basically we don't want people to put themselves in danger, but we hope that people can find a way to be involved and to support. And, sometimes we do have to step out of our comfort zone and try things out. And then maybe it doesn't fit, try it again and find a place that you can do things. But I think there is a way for everybody to find a way to support. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm not being rude here by looking at my phone and my computer. I'm navigating the questions that are coming in. And we've gotten a couple of requests that Kathy and Trey, we can capture the names of the organizations that you've mentioned, and also your electronic version of your cards for people. So we'll be sure to circulate that, make that available after the program. Okay, thank you. Do you want to do your reading?
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'll stand.
Yeah. And while they're getting that set up, if you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat if you're online, or we'll take questions here.
Yeah, this is so funny because Brian Nia's face is huge in this laptop right here. So I feel like I'm giving you a private reading, Brian. Yes. So I have 3 short pieces. Oh, one of them I actually need my phone for because it's a document that we still have online. And then I'm going to ask everyone to do a little calm response with me for the last one. So get your vocals ready, please. Calendar, my photographs. Okay, there we go. So thank you for letting me read some poetry. Again, I hope you all will keep writing, will write anew, keep thinking about creative ways to communicate and also to process, right? I think that I write a lot just to help myself process information and deal with the world. All right, so I'm going to just read. War near war. To measure hate, I can say I know love well. I can measure fear as I share company with joy and understanding often enough. But in the scale of war, to measure against peace, to measure peace onto itself, we have never held that mirror. Even in our well-lit streets or suburban living rooms with plants dying on filtered water, we have no idea how to mark the end of war or the beginning of peace, except in moments of forgetfulness. Forget last week's bombings. Forget Monday through Friday on BBC News. Forget civilian headcounts, families still waiting for a union, children still teething underneath rubble. In reality, is the opposite of war not peace? but instead amnesia. I measure myself on how long I can go with and how long I can go without thinking on destruction. There is war. So folks always ask, like, what do I write about? And I write about anything. Anything is fair game. Um, and then of course there's what's happening in the world that is on my mind all the time. So there are many, many poets throughout Los Angeles, that are grappling with language and power and how we self-determine that power for ourselves as well to try to contribute to some way of thinking. I was a part of a much larger effort called Fandango Obon, which is a collaboration between Great Leap, Quetzal Flores, Martha Gonzalez, Nobuko Miyamoto, and many, many other artists. We gather once a year to dance together, from Muslim Sufi Hadra tradition to West African dance to Obon dance, to just a collective community dance in concentric circles. So please look out for that. It's a great gathering. There are so many just walks of life and different ages of people that joined us. And just about a month before Fandango Obon happened this year, I got a call from Nobuko. She was very charged up because just a few days before our annual Nisei Week festival in Little Tokyo, right in front of the Japanese American National Museum, ICE showed up. And it was horrible. It was a horror, right? And there were community people who were extremely upset. There were elders who were yelling on the sidewalk, and one person in particular, yet another person that I see him in community. I don't necessarily think of him as like a community organizer or an activist even, but he's really engaged in community and he really cares about what happens to people. And he wrote this huge, huge letter to all the people involved in Issei Week, and he was so angry. And he said, how dare they show up in our neighborhood? How dare they show up literally at the point where our folks had to line up with their 2 suitcases to then be shipped off to camp. And Nobuko took in his letter, and she called up Ruben Guevara, myself, and then Sharon Bridgeforth, 3 poets, and asked us, she's like, you must write a collaborative piece about this and what's happening. And so it's a very long piece. I'm just going to share with you words from Ruben. I do have his permission. So we were able to share this in a collective poem. And one part he said, on this corner, let us remember, they might deport our bodies, but they cannot deport history, truth, and facts. They cannot deport our ancestors, our culture, our voices, our spirit, our memory, our anger, our love, our courage, our soul. They cannot deport the wind, the rain, the mountains, the trees, the rivers, because we are alive in the land. Remember, 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 our dreams and courage are in the rain. They nourish us, the living spirit seeds birthed by the stars and Mother Earth. Our spirits cannot be deported. Our seeds will grow and flourish like fearless, ferocious, wild flowers. So just want to leave you with a short poem, and I'm going to read it once, and then I'm going to say a line, and then you're going to repeat after me. How does it sound? I, as an organizer, love to have words be infused and go through the vibration of your bodies. And I feel like it sticks with you in a different way. So indulge me, please. This is called Weeds. Let us grow peace like a weed that crawls up the sidewalks of every street, so pervasive, so profound, it becomes impossible to kill. Let us grow peace. Okay, ready? Let us grow peace.
Let us grow peace
Like a weed
like a weed
that crawls up the sidewalks
off the sidewalk
of every street.
of every
So pervasive, so profound,
so grace, so profound.
it becomes impossible to kill.
It becomes impossible. Kill.
Let us grow peace.
Let us grow peace.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. We have a few questions. Brian, I'm wondering if I could toss this first one to you. And this is Gerald Ramada, Washington, D.C. Hi, Gerald. What was the government's authority to detain Japanese from Latin America in Crystal City, Texas?
I actually don't know the answer to that. The legality, the legal side of that. I wonder if one of the legal scholars do. But I mean, essentially, that was he's referring to the I think what would be accurately called kidnapping of Japanese Latin Americans by the U.S. government in cooperation with the governments of those countries to serve as prisoners to be exchanged with Japan for the return of American prisoners. That didn't quite happen, so they ended up, many of them, getting detained at Crystal City.
Yeah, Bob, I don't know if you know anything more about this. I think there were some protocols that were the hemispheric security agreements. Cole was the Secretary of State, and there were some agreements in terms of what was considered to be in the support of hemispheric security between North America and South America.
I have nothing to add to that.
And then there's a question about. Oh, let me come back. Let me come back to the questions about the status of the amicus briefs. Brian, would you have anything to add about Snow Country Prison Project in Bismarck, North Dakota, or maybe Kathy? Okay.
Sure, yeah. I was actually involved with that. Yeah, there's a memorial. There was just had its unveiling like a month ago. It turns out that the former Fort Lincoln that served as the internment site, one of the three main internment sites for West Coast Issei, later became a tribal college, the second tribal college in the country. It's now called United Tribes Technical College. And the college, working with the Japanese American community, constructed a memorial courtyard honoring those who were held, Issei, who were held at that site. I think, Kathy, you mentioned your family were among those, I believe. And so the names are all carved on the memorial. And the fascinating thing about it is that it's one of the only sites where the actual buildings that were used to hold the internees at the time are still intact and still, in fact, in use. So the actual building, one of the buildings that we use as a detention barracks is where the courtyard is. It was right in front. So it's quite an interesting project that kind of connects the Native American and Japanese American communities, and the project is kind of ongoing.
Bob, there's a question about the status of the amicus briefs.
Sure. So right now, earlier I said that the Fifth Circuit is going to hear the case en banc, and so there's a new briefing schedule, and we're planning to refile in that case. At this point in time, there are other cases going on. I don't know where things are in terms of the Ninth Circuit, the 10th Circuit, the Second Circuit, and the Third Circuit, in part because everybody had been just sort of thinking, oh, the Fifth Circuit case is going to be the one that goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so if those cases start to move in those other circuits, we are ready to file in those cases. Part of it is that you never know how the case is going to get up to the U.S. Supreme Court. What is the posture? And that's also why we're planning to file again in the Fifth Circuit en banc, in part because right now, the earlier opinion 2-1 that found that the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act was improper. Well, the other thing that could happen is that facts could change, including the military actions where boats are being sunk. And they're being declared military actions. And it's interesting then to think about if those are considered to be the threat of an incursion associated with the with the national government, that actually provides a stronger legal basis for some of these courts that might have less courage, SCOTUS, that might have less courage to go along with what the administration is doing. And so I'm just so concerned about those killings. These are extraterritorial, extrajudicial executions that are taking place. And once those get constructed as the threat of an incursion, that ratchets up everything that can be done internally. So right now it's extraterritorial, but the point about the extraterritorial is there's a threat internally, and there's also the rhetoric, the narrative that is being constructed about the enemy within. And we're seeing that also with regard to the deployment of the National Guard, the speeches to the military, this idea or notion of the enemy within. If that becomes the controlling narrative, you can see how the threat is for all of us who can be considered the enemy within.
You want to take a moment and talk about the use of the emergency docket by the Supreme Court?
So, there's this thing called the emergency docket, which is very frustrating for many of us who are trying to challenge the actions of the executive. And so what happens is that when a lower court issues an injunction, so when a lower court says with regard to the executive order on birthright citizenship, that that's unconstitutional and says that that has to be enjoined, and then it goes up to the circuits that have decided this, and all of the courts and all of the circuits that have decided this have said, yes, it's unconstitutional, and have also authorized a national injunction in those circumstances. Well, that case went up very quickly where the government goes to the Supreme Court and says, we have an emergency. And the emergency is that unless we can proceed with enforcing this, we are in danger, and you have to tell those lower courts that their orders cannot continue to be enforced. So this is the emergency docket, so-called shadow docket, that some scholars have begun calling it. Now, when we think about immigration matters that went up to the emergency docket with regard to actions by the Biden administration versus emergency docket where it's the Trump administration, what we find is that this Supreme Court was much better about leaving in place lower court injunctions when it was the Biden administration than it is now when it's the Trump administration where the lower courts are saying, stop. The US Supreme Court then is saying to the government, you can go on doing these things while it's being decided below, even though it has not yet been fully briefed. One of the cases that I'm involved in, I had the privilege of representing 137 members of Congress. It has to do with determination of protected status for temporary protected status for Venezuelans. It's gone up twice to the emergency docket, and the court has the second time around, even though the lower court has decided after a trial on the merits that this is illegal, the US Supreme Court has said, well, we're going to allow the government to continue in this circumstance if they want to deport Venezuelans who had previous protection while the lower courts continue deciding the merits before we finally decided on the merits. It's so frustrating because when I see what's going on in the stress test to our constitutional democracy, the lower courts are doing a really good job of saying certain things are in excess of constitutional authority. But what we keep saying over and over and over again with the emergency docket is the Supreme Court is saying, yeah, you go ahead, while we figure it out ultimately.
I'll just add to that because I think part of the problem too is there's just no explanation. So another emergency docket case
regarding the TRO that was issued for these enforcement operations in Southern California based on those 4 factors. All we had was Justice Kavanaugh's concurring opinion, but we don't know really what the majority decided. And I have a friend who is on this, I think you know him and work with him on the TPS cases, Ahilan Arunalandam. And he says, literally lawlessness, because what are the laws that you're relying on, at least to be able to direct the lower courts? But we don't know. And then is it binding or not in these emergencies? I think most people say no, it's not.
We're getting some comments to make sure that we are talking into the mics for the online audience. So we're gonna, in the last few minutes, try to do a better job of that. Gene, there's a question about mentioning that currently detained persons are consenting to leave the US rather than endure continued detention. Can you elaborate on that decision or the choice that they have, and is there any benefit to them in agreeing?
I mean, this is a complicated area because there's different ways to leave. So some people may be eligible for what's called voluntary departure, which is minimizes the impact that a removal order has. So the removal, if one is ordered removed from the US and colloquially they deport, there's consequences, including bars from returning to the US. And so voluntary departure is actually kind of a form of relief where somebody can leave voluntarily and not have the consequences of a removal order. The problem is a lot of people aren't going to be eligible. And we also have the self-deportation app, and that is not the same thing. And so it's really questionable whether somebody would benefit from giving up. So it's important, and part of the due process protections they include a right to an attorney, but at no cost to the government. So if you don't have an attorney, you have to represent yourself. So you have to make these decisions on your own based on law that you aren't an expert in or really know. And frankly, I find it very hard to stay on top of, and that's all I do all day. So I think that so I think that that there are people who are giving up, and whether or not they're getting any benefit from that other than just physically going back to their country and not being in a detention camp in Texas, for example, might be the only benefit. But there could be people who might be able to kind of avoid some consequences. But then the other non-legal consequences of separation from family and maybe daydreaming are still in.
In our last few minutes, are there any questions from our in-person audience?
I just have like a comment, and I guess I'll introduce myself first. My name's Gabby. I'm a doctoral student here in American Culture Studies, studying Japanese American history. And I actually had the privilege of meeting Tracy and Kathy on the Kasha project like a year ago. So it's good to see you again. But I just have like a little comment. So I used to live in New York, and I've just moved to Los Angeles, and on the bus, going to work, I used to work in a museum.
Do you want to come on down here and talk into one of the mics?
Oh, into the mic?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Is the people online?
Yeah, we're just getting comments that we need to talk into the mic. Sure.
Can everybody hear now?
Go for it.
So I was on the bus in New York City reading the book, The Japanese American Literature of the Japanese American Incarceration.
Frank's book.
Yes, yeah. And this person on the bus next to me, an older Caucasian man, was like, "What are you reading?" And like naturally in our current political moment, I was a little bit like, "Oh, I'm just reading a book." And he was very curious. And I ended up telling him what it was about. And he goes, "Oh, one of my best friends was in camp." And I think that just speaks to your point of the power of words and sharing stories and things. And anyway, that interaction went a lot better than I had anticipated.
Glad to hear.
So I just wanted to share that with you. Because when I first met you, that book had just come out, like I think that weekend. And then like a year later, someone was like, "Oh, interested in learning more about it." So there you go.
So you'll have to tell Frank.
I will tell.
Yeah.
Sure. You know, I think that's the thing too, like about, the taking the chance to have a conversation. Obviously, we all have to pick our battles and you have to be in a safe space, but you are in a public space. So I always think it's like, if this goes bad, I'm gonna not see them in about 2 minutes. So what do I have to lose? Right? So yeah, it's great.
Just one,
That's the last word.
just one last comment is that I think what you said triggered reminding me that I think what we all have to try to do, and this may sound a little, I don't know, corny, but build community, build and take those chances and talking to people and not, because we can't judge what people are going to say or what they think. And even if they do have something different, just to do that, but building community wherever we're at. And because we lack so much community right now.
Can I say add to that one thing? That we also have to pace ourselves and trust that we're part of a bigger team. But to be as active as we can as a teammate.
I want to say something. But I want to talk about the power of protest. And so in 2020, I had the privilege of representing Black Lives Matter, Seattle King County, and individual named plaintiffs challenging the use of force against peaceful protesters by the police. I was working with Perkins Coie attorneys and ACU of Washington. One of the people who was one of the named plaintiffs, Sheriff Sakamoto, was born in Camp Minidoka. And part of what story that she told in the complaint and in her declaration is that she understands the power of protest because she also understands the protest that did not occur during World War II. And she speculated, what if people had taken to the streets then? And not Japanese Americans, but the non-Japanese Americans, everybody else. And so instead of wearing buttons saying, I'm not Japanese, and for people who didn't have to wear buttons saying, I'm not Japanese because their skin said that they weren't Japanese, the thing is that if people took to the streets, would Japanese American incarceration have taken place? It's an unprovable counterfactual, but I believe in the power of protest, which is why it was so important during that moment to try to put a stop to what the city of Seattle was doing to protesters.
Well, we have so much to take away, so much to think about, so much to do. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and especially my colleagues here that made the effort, FAA and family emergencies and all the traffic and train delays notwithstanding, we all made it, and thank you so much for what I hope has been a rich and informative experience. And as Dan Rather used to say, courage. And thank you. We'll send out some information that some of you have requested online. Thanks for joining us.